I am Rick Dawson, 69 years old, and my life permanently changed the day I finally stopped paying for my own disrespect. Last Tuesday, I quietly changed my banking details and transferred my monthly structural engineering pension to a secure private card. 2 hours later, the front door of my modest guest house was violently kicked open. My daughter Sarah and her husband Mitchell stood in the entryway, absolutely furious. Mitchell screamed that the old debit card had just been swallowed by an ATM at a luxury car dealership, and he demanded my new personal identification number immediately. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, looked him dead in the eye, and gave him an answer that made the blood drain entirely from his face. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little world, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe respect should be earned, never demanded. The wood of the doorframe splintered inward, sending shards of white paint scattering across my clean hardwood floor. I did not flinch. I sat at my small kitchen table, my hands perfectly steady around my ceramic coffee mug. Mitchell stormed into the room first. His face was a violent shade of purple, veins bulging against the collar of his expensive designer shirt. Sarah followed closely behind him, hyperventilating, her hands frantically clutching a leather designer handbag that I had unwittingly paid for. Mitchell did not bother with a greeting. He slammed his fist down onto my kitchen table, causing my coffee to slosh over the rim and burn my knuckles. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive espresso and blind rage. He screamed that he had just been humiliated in the finance office of a high-end European auto dealership downtown. He was trying to put down a $10,000 cash deposit on a brand new sports SUV. When he went to the dealership lobby ATM to pull a cash advance using my card, the machine instantly confiscated it. The screen had flashed a terrifying message indicating the account was permanently closed due to suspected fraud. The salesman had looked at Mitchell as if he were a common criminal. Mitchell demanded to know what glitch had occurred. He thrust his open palm perfectly flat in front of my face and demanded that I hand over the new banking card and the updated personal identification number right this second so he could drive back downtown and secure his vehicle. Sarah stood behind him, nodding vigorously, whining that the dealership was going to sell the car to someone else if they did not hurry. I did not raise my voice. I did not tremble. I reached for a paper napkin, slowly wiped the spilled coffee from my knuckles, and looked up at the two of them. I let the silence stretch until the sheer weight of it made Sarah shift uncomfortably on her feet. 3 years ago, standing over my late wife's fresh grave, Sarah had wept and begged me to come live in the guest house on her property. She promised she would take care of me. She asked for my debit card, claiming she wanted to manage my weekly grocery shopping, so I would not have to worry about driving to the supermarket in my grief. I trusted my only child. I handed her the plastic card tied to my $5,500 monthly pension. I looked at Sarah now and asked her a very simple question. I asked her what she had bought me for dinner this week. She blinked, completely thrown off guard by the pivot. She stammered, looking at Mitchell for help, before muttering that she had dropped off groceries on Monday. I stood up from my chair and walked the 4 steps to my small pantry. I swung the door wide open. Inside sat 3 dented cans of generic chicken soup and a half-empty box of stale crackers. I turned back to them and stated the facts. I told them my pension had deposited over $60,000 into that account over the past 12 months alone. I pointed to the dented cans and asked if that was what $60,000 bought in today's economy. Mitchell rolled his eyes, letting out a loud theatrical sigh of supreme annoyance. He told me I was being dramatic, and that I did not need much money anyway, because I just sat around the guest house all day doing nothing. He insisted they were doing me a massive favor by letting me live on their property. He slapped the table again, demanding we stop wasting time talking about soup when his luxury car reservation was expiring. I walked over to the small bookshelf in the corner of my living room. I reached behind a row of old engineering textbooks and pulled out a massive, heavy black binder. I walked back to the table and dropped it directly in front of Mitchell. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the small room. I opened the cover. Inside were hundreds of pages of highlighted bank statements, forensic accounting notes, and printed photographs. I looked Mitchell straight in the eye and told him the account was not experiencing a glitch. I told him I had personally walked into the bank branch at 8 o'clock that morning, closed the account permanently, and transferred all future pension payouts to a private institution that neither of them would ever access. Mitchell scoffed, calling me a paranoid old fool. He claimed he only used the money for property upkeep. I turned to the first tab in the binder. I began to read his exact expenditures out loud, my voice echoing like a judge delivering a sentence. I read the date and time of a $4,000 charge for a VIP cabana in Miami, booked while I was recovering from a severe bout of pneumonia alone in this guest house. I read off the weekly $300 charges at a high-end steakhouse downtown. The same nights Sarah claimed they were too busy working late to bring me a hot meal. I flipped the page and read the itemized receipt for Sarah's new diamond tennis bracelet, purchased with funds explicitly earmarked for my supplemental health insurance. I read line after line, dollar after dollar, proving exactly how they had systematically drained my life savings to fund an arrogant, lavish lifestyle while treating me like a stray dog living in their backyard. I told them the gravy train had derailed. I told them they would never see another dime of my money and that they needed to leave my home immediately before I called the police to report the past 3 years of elder financial abuse. I expected them to cower. I expected Sarah to cry and beg for forgiveness. I expected Mitchell to panic about his ruined credit. I was entirely wrong. Mitchell did not apologize. A cold, menacing sneer crept across his face. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thin, unmarked manila folder. He tossed it onto my binder with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He leaned forward, his arrogance entirely restored. He told me I was not calling the police and I certainly was not keeping my money. He informed me that he had been preparing for this exact moment. He tapped the manila folder and explained what was inside. It was a drafted legal petition for full involuntary conservatorship. He told me that over the past 6 months, he and Sarah had been documenting my supposed mental decline. He claimed I was becoming paranoid, forgetful, and dangerously unstable. He smiled a sickeningly sweet smile and revealed that he had already paid a substantial sum to a private physician. This doctor, whom I had never even met, had signed a sworn medical affidavit declaring that I was suffering from advanced, rapid-onset dementia and was entirely incapable of managing my own finances or making basic life decisions. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sympathy. She told me it was for my own good. She said my mind was clearly failing since I was making up crazy stories about them stealing my money. She told me a judge would look at my age, look at the doctor's signature, and immediately grant them total legal control over my life, my health, and my remaining bank accounts. Mitchell checked his expensive gold watch. He looked back at me and delivered his ultimatum. He gave me exactly 24 hours to voluntarily hand over the new bank card, the PAISON, and sign a general power of attorney document giving him control of my assets. If I did exactly as I was told, they would generously allow me to keep living in the guest house. If I refused, he would file the petition at the county courthouse tomorrow morning. He promised that once the judge ruled in his favor, my assets would be seized, and he would have me forcibly removed from the property and locked away in the cheapest, most miserable state-run nursing facility he could find, where I would spend the rest of my days heavily medicated and completely forgotten. Mitchell grabbed Sarah by the arm, turned around, and walked out the door. Sarah did not even look back at me. They left the splintered door hanging wide open, the cold afternoon wind blowing into my kitchen. They thought they had backed a helpless, senile old man into a corner. They thought I would spend the night trembling in fear, waiting to surrender. They had no idea that my silence was not fear. It was the sound of a structural engineer realizing exactly where the weak points in their foundation were and preparing to bring their entire house crashing down to the ground. I stood in the center of my small kitchen, listening to the sound of Mitchell's car engine fading down the driveway. The cold afternoon wind continued to blow through the splintered doorframe. Most men my age would have collapsed into the nearest chair. Most men would have reached for a telephone to call a friend, or perhaps even cried over the sheer cruelty of their own flesh and blood. I did not do any of those things. I am a retired structural engineer. I spent 40 years calculating load-bearing walls, stress fractures, and the exact moment a foundation will buckle under pressure. I knew immediately that Mitchell was not acting out of mere anger over a canceled car reservation. His confidence was too absolute. His timeline of 24 hours was too specific. The pension was merely the loose thread. The true prize was something much larger. If they were willing to commit perjury by hiring a corrupt doctor to declare me legally incompetent, they were not doing it just to secure my monthly checks. They were doing it to seize total control of my entire estate. They wanted the main house, the property, the investments, and the authority to liquidate my entire existence. I had built a fortress for my daughter, and now her husband was trying to lock me in the dungeon. I walked into my bedroom, put on my heavy wool coat, and grabbed my car keys. I had less than 23 hours left. I backed my vintage car out of the driveway and headed straight toward the downtown financial district. The drive took exactly 35 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, mirroring the cold, calculated focus settling over my mind. I was no longer a grieving widower trying to keep the peace. I was a man preparing for war. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the tallest glass building in the city. I rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor. The polished brass letters on the double glass doors read, "Evans and Associates." Bradley Evans was not a friendly neighborhood attorney. He was a ruthless, highly expensive estate lawyer who specialized in dismantling hostile or corporate takeovers and entirely destroying fraudulent asset grabs. I had hired Bradley a decade ago to structure my original trust, and I knew he possessed the exact lack of mercy I currently required. The receptionist at the front desk opened her mouth to ask if I had an appointment, but I walked straight past her mahogany desk. I pushed open the heavy oak door to Bradley's private corner office. He looked up from his computer screen, his sharp eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He saw the expression on my face, immediately closed his laptop, and gestured toward the leather chair across from him. I did not offer a polite greeting. I sat down and placed both of my hands flat on his desk. I told him my son-in-law had just threatened me with an involuntary conservatorship petition and possessed a forged medical affidavit declaring me mentally incompetent. Bradley did not gasp or express sympathetic outrage. He simply reached for a fresh legal pad and a silver pen. He asked me for the exact timeline. I told him Mitchell had given me a 24-hour ultimatum to sign over my power of attorney, or he would file the petition with the county courthouse tomorrow morning. Bradley wrote down 3 words on the pad and underlined them twice. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the pen against his chin. He told me that in this state, a corrupt judge could grant an emergency temporary conservatorship based solely on a sworn physician statement, especially if the petitioner claimed the elderly subject was a danger to themselves. Once that temporary order was signed, Mitchell would have immediate unchecked legal authority to freeze my bank accounts, change the locks on my guest house, and forcefully relocate me to a psychiatric ward for evaluation. Bradley looked me directly in the eyes and told me we were no longer dealing with a greedy family dispute. We were operating inside a highly coordinated legal ambush. Bradley immediately picked up his desk phone and dialed his senior paralegal. He ordered her to drop every other file and run an emergency background check on all legal filings under Mitchell's name across every county in the state. He wanted to know exactly which corrupt doctor Mitchell had paid off. As we waited, Bradley pulled up my master estate file on his massive dual monitors. He reviewed the deed to the property where Sarah and Mitchell currently lived. I had paid for that house in cash 15 years ago. I had put the deed in my own name to protect Sarah in case her marriage ever failed. I told Bradley that Mitchell had always hated living in a house he did not legally own. Bradley began running a real-time audit on the property. Title history, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The office was completely silent, except for the rapid clicking of the keys. Suddenly, Bradley stopped typing. The cursor blinked ominously on the screen. He leaned closer to the monitor, his jaw tightening. He slowly turned the monitor around so I could see the screen. He pointed to a newly registered lien recorded against the main property just 3 weeks ago. Mitchell had not just been stealing my pension. He had discovered a way to bypass the title and borrow against the physical dirt beneath my feet. The legal battlefield had just expanded, and the sheer scale of their betrayal was finally coming into the light. I looked at the massive dollar amount displayed on the glowing screen. Mitchell was attempting to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars before locking me away forever. Our race against time had officially begun. I stared at the glowing computer screen on Bradley's mahogany desk. The word lien was entirely foreign to my understanding of that specific property. 15 years ago, I walked into a commercial real estate office and wrote a certified cashier's check for the full purchase price of that house. I did it because my daughter Sarah was complaining about the immense stress of potentially taking on a 30-year mortgage. I wanted my only child to have a permanent fortress. I wanted to give her a home that could never be taken away by a collapsing economy or a sudden job loss. I handed them the keys with a completely clean title. There was no mortgage. There was no corporate bank involved in the transaction. The dirt, the wood, the concrete foundation, and the roof belonged entirely to me. Now my attorney was showing me a digital county record indicating that a massive financial institution had a legal claim to the property. I asked Bradley to open the specific legal filing. I needed to see the exact structural weakness Mitchell had secretly introduced into my foundation. Bradley did not hesitate or offer empty words of comfort. He quickly typed his secure credentials into the county clerk's digital database. The system took an agonizingly long time to load. The small icon spun in a continuous circle against the stark white background of the large monitor. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather guest chair. I felt a cold, heavy knot forming in the absolute center of my chest. It was not panic. It was the precise, chilling sensation I used to get when I stood beneath a massive concrete bridge and spotted a hairline fracture in a primary support column. It was the sickening realization that a catastrophic collapse was no longer a distant possibility, but a guaranteed certainty. Finally, the digital document rendered on the screen. It was a scanned copy of a heavily notarized loan agreement. Bradley enlarged the document so the black text filled the entire monitor. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on the edge of the desk. The document was an official home equity line of credit. Mitchell had used the house as direct collateral to secure an open tap of liquid cash. I looked at the principal amount approved by the bank underwriter. The number was $300,000. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. $300,000. Mitchell had secretly borrowed a massive fortune against the very walls I had purchased to keep his wife safe. Bradley slowly scrolled down through the dozens of pages of standard banking clauses and strict legal terms. His eyes scanned the dense paragraphs with the speed and precision born of a predator hunting for a weakness. He calmly explained that a home equity line of credit operates exactly like a massive credit card, tied directly to the current market value of the property. If the borrower defaults on the monthly payments, the bank aggressively forecloses and takes the house. Mitchell had essentially strapped a ticking financial bomb to my daughter's living room. I looked at Bradley and stated a simple, indisputable fact. I told him that I was the sole legal owner listed on the property deed. I asked him how a federally regulated bank could legally approve a cash loan of that incredible magnitude without my physical presence in their office or my verbal consent. Bradley did not answer my question immediately. He kept scrolling down until he reached the final page of the scanned document. It was the primary signature page. There were 3 distinct black lines printed at the bottom of the paper. The first line was designated for the primary loan applicant. The second line was for the CO applicant. The third line was specifically designated for the guarantor and legal property owner. That line was meant for me. I looked closely at the digital ink on the screen. My full legal name was written directly on that line. Richard Alexander Dawson. I felt a sudden massive rush of pure, absolute clarity wash over my mind. It was not my handwriting. As a career structural engineer, I spent decades drafting incredibly precise blueprints by hand, long before computers took over the industry. My personal handwriting is entirely distinct and highly regimented. My capital letters always feature a sharp, rigid angle at the top loop. My lowercase letters are completely uniform in height and spacing. The signature displayed on the monitor was a sloppy, arrogant imitation. The angle of the letters leaned far too heavily to the right. The pressure of the pen strokes was highly inconsistent, indicating that the person writing it was frequently pausing to look at a reference document. It was Mitchell. He had forged my signature to steal $300,000 of my hard-earned equity. I pointed to the glowing screen and told Bradley exactly what I saw. I broke down the physical mechanics of the obvious forgery with the exact same cold detachment I would use to explain a failed concrete pour to a construction crew. Bradley nodded slowly, his face completely devoid of surprise. He leaned back in his tall leather chair and steepled his fingers together. He told me that executing this level of financial fraud requires a highly coordinated and deliberate effort. Mitchell did not just sit at a kitchen table and forge my signature. He had to falsify my personal income statements, provide fake tax returns to the bank underwriters, and most importantly, find a highly corrupt or criminally negligent notary public to legally stamp the document. Bradley pointed to the blurry blue notary seal stamped directly next to my forged name. He wrote the name of the notary down on his yellow legal pad. He looked me in the eye and told me that this single piece of paper escalated the situation from a minor family dispute over a stolen pension into federal bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. He stated clearly that these are severe felonies that carry mandatory federal prison sentences. The scattered pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped together in my mind with terrifying precision. I finally understood the arrogant 24-hour ultimatum Mitchell had delivered in my kitchen. I finally understood the fake dementia diagnosis and the immediate threat of involuntary conservatorship. Mitchell was not trying to steal my future monthly pension checks. He had already stolen $300,000, and the money was completely gone. I explained my theory to Bradley. Mitchell had likely maxed out the fraudulent credit line to fund his lavish vacations and luxury car purchases. The monthly interest payments on a loan of that size were likely astronomical. He was drowning in his own hidden debt. If he missed a single payment, the bank would issue a formal default notice directly to me because I am the legal property owner. The entire criminal scheme would be instantly exposed. The only way Mitchell could prevent me from discovering the massive property lien was to have a judge declare me legally incompetent. If he successfully became my court-appointed conservator, he would intercept all my incoming mail, control my bank accounts, and have the legal authority to quietly sell the house to cover his tracks while I rotted away in a locked psychiatric ward. The most devastating realization of the afternoon was not the stolen money or the forged signature. It was Sarah. I sat back in the chair and looked out the massive window of Bradley's office at the gray city skyline. I thought about my only daughter standing in my kitchen just an hour ago. She had nodded eagerly when Mitchell threatened to lock me away in a state-run nursing facility. She had looked at me with disgust and called me crazy. Was she fully aware of the forged $300,000 loan? Or was she simply a willing participant in the smaller plan to steal my pension money? I realized in that quiet office that the answer did not matter anymore. She had chosen her side. She had stood by silently while an arrogant man threatened to permanently strip away my basic human rights. She had treated the father who gave her everything like a disposable inconvenience. The lingering emotional attachment I had to the idea of my family completely evaporated in that room, leaving behind nothing but cold resolve. I turned my attention back to my attorney. I told Bradley that I did not want to merely stop the conservatorship petition. I wanted to completely dismantle their comfortable leftsuns. I wanted every single illegal action exposed to the absolute harshest light of the law. Bradley smiled for the first time since I walked into his office. It was a cold, sharp smile that promised absolute ruin for my enemies. He told me that in order to destroy them, we had to ensure my mental competency was completely unquestionable. The forged signature was a powerful weapon. But if Mitchell managed to get a corrupt judge to sign the emergency conservatorship order tomorrow morning, all my assets, including my ability to pay Bradley, would be frozen instantly. I asked him what our immediate next move had to be. He looked at the heavy clock on his office wall. It was 3 p.m. He told me I was going to undergo the most rigorous psychological and cognitive evaluation available in the state. He said I was going to secure certified legal proof of my perfect mental health before the sun came up tomorrow. Bradley made a single phone call to a private expedited medical clinic authorized by the state Supreme Court. At 6 a.m, I was sitting in the sterile waiting room of the Cognitive Evaluation Center. I had not slept a single minute the night before. I spent the entire night sitting at my small kitchen table reviewing decades of complex mathematical formulas and structural engineering blueprints from my memory. I needed my mind to be as sharp as a scalpel. I was not going to let a greedy son-in-law steal my dignity based on a lie. A young nurse called my name and led me down a long white hallway into a windowless examination room. 3 doctors were waiting for me seated behind a long folding table. They were the state-appointed independent medical board. Their sole job was to determine if an elderly citizen was mentally fit to manage their own life or if they needed to be stripped of their basic human rights and handed over to a legal guardian. The lead doctor was a stern-looking woman with a thick metal clipboard. She explained that the evaluation would last 4 grueling hours. It would cover memory retention, spatial awareness, complex problem-solving, and emotional stability. She warned me that the testing was explicitly designed to induce severe mental fatigue and frustration in order to break down any hidden cognitive walls. I looked at her and smiled. I told her I spent 40 years calculating wind shear resistance on steel suspension bridges while dealing with screaming city contractors and delayed material shipments. I told her mental fatigue was simply my Tuesday afternoon. She did not smile back. She started a heavy silver stopwatch on the desk, and the absolute interrogation began. They started with basic memory recall. They gave me a list of 30 random, completely unconnected words and told me I would need to repeat them in exact order an hour later. Then they moved to spatial reasoning. They handed me a thick packet of complex geometric shapes printed on paper and asked me to mentally rotate them and identify the correct corresponding shadow from a list of incredibly similar options. It was a complete insult to a man who used to draft 3-dimensional load-bearing schematics by hand before computer software existed. I completed the spatial packet in less than 5 minutes. The second doctor raised an eyebrow and quietly took the papers from my hand, checking my answers against an answer key. His eyes widened slightly as he realized I had not made a single mistake. Then came the mathematical logic portion. They asked me to perform rapid sequential subtractions of prime numbers descending from a massive starting figure. I did not even blink or pause to take a breath. I rattled off the numbers with the precise rhythmic cadence of a metronome staring directly at the wall behind them. The third hour was entirely psychological and conversational. They wanted to see if I was suffering from paranoia or age-related delusions. The lead doctor asked me why I believed my family was trying to steal my money. She asked if I was hearing voices or seeing things that were not actually there. I leaned forward in my chair. I did not sound angry or defensive. I sounded purely clinical and detached. I calmly explained the exact sequence of events that had occurred over the last 24 hours. I detailed the closed bank account, the missing pension funds, and the forged $300,000 home equity line of credit. I gave them exact dates, exact dollar amounts, and the specific name of the corrupt notary public my attorney had identified during our real-time audit. I told them I was not paranoid or confused. I was simply the primary victim of highly documented financial fraud. I told them my attorney Bradley Evans would be subpoenaing this very medical record to use in a federal bank fraud trial against my own family. The room grew incredibly quiet. The doctors stopped writing on their clipboards and stared at me. The fourth and final hour arrived. The lead doctor asked me to recite the 30 random words she had given me at the very beginning of the evaluation. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I recited all 30 words perfectly. Then I recited them in reverse alphabetical order just to make my point absolutely clear. The stopwatch clicked off. The three doctors gathered their papers and left the room to deliberate in private. I sat alone in the quiet white room for 20 agonizing minutes. I listened to the low hum of the fluorescent lights above me. I felt a profound sense of peace settling over my chest. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what my mind was capable of achieving. The door finally opened and the lead doctor walked back in. She was no longer stern or clinical. She looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and genuine shock. She placed a heavy stack of papers on the desk directly in front of me. It was the official medical affidavit. She looked me in the eyes and told me I had scored in the 99th percentile for cognitive function. She said my spatial reasoning and mathematical logic were significantly better than most graduate students she evaluated on a daily basis. She formally declared that I was completely, entirely, and legally competent to manage my own affairs, my own finances, and my massive estate. She signed her name at the bottom of the document in thick black ink. The two other doctors walked in and signed their names right below hers. The lead doctor stamped the paper with the official raised seal of the State Medical Board, making it an undeniable legal fact. She handed the document to me and told me she wished me the absolute best of luck in putting my son-in-law exactly where he belonged. I walked out of the medical center at 10 in the morning. The bright morning sun hit my face, warming my skin. I held the sealed envelope tightly in my right hand. It was the ultimate shield. It was the absolute undeniable proof that Mitchell's entire conservatorship plan was built on a desperate criminal lie. If he walked into a county courthouse to file his fake dementia claim, he would be instantly arrested for perjury and filing false legal documents. I reached my car and unlocked the door. I pulled out my cell phone to call Bradley. I was ready to launch the aggressive counter-offensive. I was ready to move from defense to offense and finally trap Mitchell in his own web of arrogance and lies. I stood in the sunlit parking lot of the medical center, holding the sealed envelope containing my absolute freedom. The heavy weight that had rested on my chest since yesterday afternoon was entirely gone. I had the legal ammunition to destroy Mitchell's malicious plan before he could even file his fake paperwork at the courthouse. I reached into my coat pocket to retrieve my car keys. My fingers brushed against my cell phone. The screen lit up with a sudden sharp vibration. It was a priority notification email from my personal banking application. I frowned. I had completely closed my primary accounts the day before. There should have been no active alerts on my phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. The email was not from my usual local bank. It was an automated security alert from the massive national financial institution that held the fraudulent $300,000 home equity line of credit. Because my name was forged as the primary guarantor on the account, the bank's automated system had pulled my contact information from my credit file and sent me a standard courtesy notification regarding a massive outbound transaction. I stared at the screen and felt the blood freeze in my veins. The notification was a digital wire transfer receipt. 10 minutes ago, Mitchell had logged into the fraudulent account and initiated a transfer for the maximum allowable limit. He was attempting to move the entire $300,000 in one single sweeping motion. I looked at the destination details printed on the digital receipt. He was not moving the money to a local checking account to buy his luxury car. The routing number was attached to a private offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. Mitchell was not just stealing my equity. He was laundering it out of the country entirely. My engineering mind immediately calculated the catastrophic implications of this move. If that wire transfer successfully cleared the United States banking system, the money would be completely untraceable and entirely unrecoverable. It would vanish into a black hole of international banking secrecy. The domestic bank would then turn around and demand the $300,000 directly from me because my forged signature was on the collateral document. If I could not produce the stolen cash, they would foreclose on the property and auction off my daughter's house to recoup their losses. Mitchell was preparing to take the money and vanish, leaving me entirely destroyed and Sarah completely homeless. He had likely realized his conservatorship plan might face legal resistance from me and decided to execute a scorched earth exit strategy. I did not panic. Panic is a useless emotion that leads to structural failure. I immediately dialed Bradley's direct cell phone number. He answered on the first ring. I read him the exact details of the wire transfer alert, including the transaction identification number and the offshore routing code. Bradley let out a sharp breath. The relaxed confidence from yesterday was entirely gone from his voice. He told me that international wire transfers of that magnitude are subject to a mandatory federal security hold, but that hold only lasts for a maximum of 2 hours. After the security window closes, the funds are released into the global network and disappear forever. We had exactly 1 hour and 50 minutes to physically stop the transaction. Bradley gave me a direct and uncompromising order. He told me not to bother calling the bank customer service hotline. A low-level telephone representative would not have the authority to halt an offshore transfer, and they would waste precious time verifying my identity while the clock ticked down. Bradley told me to drive immediately to the regional corporate headquarters of the bank, located in the center of the financial district. He said he was drafting an emergency federal fraud injunction right now and would meet me in the lobby of the bank in exactly 30 minutes. If we did not reach the regional wire manager before the security hold expired, my 15 years of hard-earned equity would be gone forever. I threw my car into gear and sped out of the medical center parking lot. I merged onto the busy morning interstate, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. The morning traffic was incredibly heavy. Brake lights flashed in front of me, creating a sea of red metal. I watched the digital clock on my dashboard ticking away the minutes. Every single minute that passed brought Mitchell closer to absolute victory. I thought about the sheer arrogance of the man. He believed he could forge my name, steal my wealth, and simply wire it to a tropical island without consequence. He believed my age made me slow and oblivious. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, weaving my vintage car through the narrow gaps in the heavy traffic. I was not going to let a spoiled, arrogant thief steal the foundation I had built for my family. I arrived at the towering glass skyscraper that housed the bank's regional headquarters with exactly 1 hour left on the security hold. I left my car parked illegally in the front loading zone, not caring about the inevitable parking ticket. I sprinted through the revolving glass doors into the massive marble lobby. Bradley was already standing near the security desk holding a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. His face was set in a grim expression of pure determination. He handed me a copy of the emergency injunction and pointed toward the row of private executive elevators. We did not have an appointment. We did not have building security badges. We only had the certified medical affidavit proving my competence and the undeniable proof of Mitchell's federal bank fraud. We walked past the protesting security guards and stepped into the elevator, hitting the button for the executive floor. The doors slid shut, sealing us inside. The ultimate confrontation was no longer a matter of days or hours. It was a matter of minutes. Mitchell was sitting somewhere right now watching his computer screen, waiting for the final confirmation of his stolen wealth. He had no idea that the man he thought he had broken was currently riding an elevator straight into the heart of the banking system, carrying the legal fire required to burn his entire offshore empire to the ground. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the absolute pinnacle of corporate banking. The 42nd floor did not look like a standard retail bank branch. There were no teller windows or waiting area chairs. The floor was covered in thick, dark carpeting that absorbed all sound. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany and lined with modern art. We stepped out of the elevator and were immediately intercepted by a woman in a sharp gray suit. She held a digital tablet and looked at us with a mixture of confusion and corporate disdain. She informed us that the executive floor was strictly by appointment only and asked security to escort us back to the lobby. Bradley did not even break his stride. He walked straight past her holding the thick stack of legal documents like a loaded weapon. He demanded to be directed to the regional director of wire operations immediately. The woman attempted to block his path, but Bradley simply stated his name and the name of his law firm. He informed her that if she delayed us for even a single minute, she would be personally named as a co-conspirator in a federal bank fraud lawsuit involving the theft of $300,000. The woman froze and silently pointed toward a large set of frosted glass doors at the end of the long hallway. We pushed through the glass doors without knocking. The regional director was a middle-aged man sitting behind a massive glass desk. He was on a phone call but hung up immediately when we barged into his private sanctuary. He stood up, his face flushing with anger, demanding to know who we were and how we had bypassed building security. Bradley walked directly to the glass desk and slammed the emergency federal fraud injunction down onto the smooth surface. The heavy sound echoed loudly in the quiet executive office. Bradley leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. He told the director to sit down and look at the screen on his computer. He recited the exact account number and the transaction identification code for the Cayman Islands wire transfer. The director hesitated, but the sheer aggressive authority radiating from my attorney forced him back into his leather chair. He typed the numbers into his keyboard. His eyes widened as the massive outbound transfer populated on his screen. The director tried to deploy standard banking protocol. He nervously adjusted his tie and stated that the transfer had already been authorized by the primary account holder. He claimed the bank could not simply halt a massive international wire without a verified court order or a direct request from the client, who initiated the transaction. Bradley smiled his cold, devastating smile. He dropped the second piece of paper onto the desk. It was a high-resolution photograph of the forged signature on the original home equity loan document placed directly next to a certified copy of my actual legal signature. Bradley told the director that the man who authorized the wire was not the legal property owner. He informed the director that the bank had negligently approved a $300,000 credit line based on an incredibly sloppy forgery. Bradley then dropped the final piece of paper. It was the certified medical affidavit from the state Supreme Court Medical Board proving my absolute mental competency. Bradley did not wait for the director to process the information. He looked at the clock on the wall. We had exactly 14 minutes remaining before the federal security hold expired and the money vanished offshore. Bradley told the director that we were completely bypassing the local banking chain of command. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed a direct number. He placed the phone on the glass desk and activated the speaker function. A stern voice answered immediately, identifying himself as a senior agent with the Federal Wire Fraud Division. Bradley had already contacted him during our drive to the bank. Bradley formally introduced me and then instructed the bank director to identify himself to the federal agent. The director was sweating profusely now. He stated his name and his corporate title. The federal agent informed the director that he was looking at the real-time routing data for the Cayman Islands transfer. The agent ordered the director to manually override the local system and execute a hard freeze on the entire account hierarchy immediately. The director tried to argue that a hard freeze would lock the entire credit line and flag the account for a mandatory federal investigation. He warned that the bank would suffer a massive loss if the collateral was tied up in a federal court battle. I finally spoke up. I leaned over the desk, looking the panicked executive dead in the eyes. I told him he was no longer worried about a financial loss. I told him he was currently harboring stolen funds. I explained that if he let that money leave the United States, I would not just sue the bank for the lost equity. I would use my remaining wealth to ensure the federal government investigated every single loan his department had approved over the last 5 years. I told him I was a structural engineer, and I knew exactly how to find the weak points in a massive corporate foundation. I promised him I would tear his entire career down to the studs. The director swallowed hard. He looked at the phone. He looked at the forged signature. He looked at the clock. We had exactly 7 minutes left. He turned back to his computer keyboard. His hands were shaking slightly as he typed a long sequence of administrative override codes into the banking software. He navigated through multiple security prompts, clicking past the standard warnings. He reached the final execution screen. He pressed the enter key with a heavy sigh of defeat. The glowing monitor on his desk instantly refreshed. The status of the $300,000 wire transfer changed from pending security clearance to a bright red flashing notification that read, "Transaction federally rejected." The funds had bounced. The money was violently yanked back from the international routing network and slammed directly back into the frozen domestic account. The absolute finality of that red flashing text was the most beautiful thing I had seen in years. The money was completely locked. The entire fraudulent home equity line of credit was permanently frozen. Mitchell could not withdraw another single dime. He could not move the money offshore. He could not even access the account to see why the transfer had failed. The federal government now had a complete stranglehold on the stolen funds. Mitchell was officially trapped in a financial cage of his own making. Bradley thanked the federal agent and ended the call. He picked up his legal documents and placed them back into his leather briefcase. He looked at the sweating bank director and advised him to retain independent legal counsel because the federal investigators would be arriving at his branch very soon to review his negligent underwriting practices. We walked out of the executive office and took the elevator back down to the lobby. The entire operation had taken less than 20 minutes. I walked out of the glass building and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight. The city noise washed over me, but my mind was incredibly quiet and focused. I had successfully defended my perimeter. I had blocked the catastrophic structural failure. But the engineering mindset requires you to anticipate the immediate consequence of applying massive counter-pressure. Mitchell was sitting at home right now. He was likely refreshing his offshore bank account, waiting to see a massive influx of stolen cash. Very soon, he was going to receive a notification that his transfer had been violently rejected and his fraudulent credit line had been completely seized by federal authorities. He was going to realize that his perfect criminal plan had just spectacularly collapsed. I knew exactly what a man like Mitchell would do when backed into a corner. He would not surrender. He would panic. He would realize he was drowning in the massive interest payments he could no longer afford. He would realize his luxury lifestyle was instantly over. Desperation breeds extreme recklessness. I looked at Bradley and told him our defensive maneuvers were complete. It was time to prepare for the inevitable retaliation. Mitchell was going to come looking for something to sell, something to pawn, something to keep his sinking ship afloat. He was going to realize my pension was gone, his fraudulent loan was gone, and his offshore escape route was destroyed. He was going to come for the last valuable thing I possessed. I got into my car and drove away from the bank knowing the real war was just about to begin. I did not drive straight home after leaving the corporate bank headquarters. I knew the exact sequence of events that was about to unfold inside the main house on my property. Mitchell would be sitting in his expensive home office, constantly refreshing his computer screen to check the status of his stolen wealth. The bright red error message from the Federal Banking Authority would suddenly appear. He would panic and dial the private wealth customer service number, only to be coldly informed that his account was permanently locked under an active federal fraud investigation. Panic is a highly predictable chemical reaction. It completely strips away human logic and leaves only raw, desperate animal instinct. I parked my car at a small diner on the edge of town and ordered a black coffee. I needed to give the rat enough time to chew blindly through the trap. Mitchell was a man currently drowning in extreme hidden debt. His credit cards were likely maxed out to their absolute limits. His luxury car reservation had been humiliatingly canceled. The offshore escape route he had banked his entire future on was now permanently sealed by the federal government. He needed liquid cash immediately to keep up the grand illusion of his wealth and to satisfy the creditors who were undoubtedly breathing down his neck. I sat in that quiet diner for exactly 3 hours, allowing the terrifying reality of his total financial ruin to completely shatter his arrogant mind. When the late afternoon sun began to dip below the distant tree line, I finally paid my bill and drove back to my property. I parked my daily driver on the street instead of turning into the long driveway. I walked the rest of the way on foot, feeling the crisp evening wind biting at my face. As I approached the guest house, I saw the immediate physical evidence of his violent desperation. The heavy wooden side door of my home was splintered and hanging open on a single broken metal hinge. He had not bothered to pick the lock or look under the flower pot for a spare key. He had used pure brute force to violate the only sanctuary I had left in the world. I stepped over the shattered wood and entered my home. The interior was completely destroyed. The small kitchen table where I drank my morning coffee was flipped upside down. Every single drawer in the living room had been ripped out and violently emptied onto the hardwood floor. My old engineering textbooks were torn and scattered across the carpet. Mitchell had torn the place apart like a starving predator, looking for anything he could quickly sell to save his own skin. He was looking for hidden cash. He was looking for valuable jewelry or bearer bonds. He fundamentally misunderstood who I was and how I operated. I never kept liquid wealth hidden in the house, but as I carefully walked into my small bedroom, my blood turned completely cold. My closet door was wide open. The heavy steel lockbox I kept hidden beneath the floorboards had been viciously pried open with a heavy steel crowbar. The thick metal of the box was twisted and bent out of shape. I slowly fell to my knees and looked inside the empty dark space. He had not found cash. He had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found the original leather key fob and the vintage paper title to the pristine 1968 Ford Mustang parked in the detached rear garage. That car was not merely a piece of classic machinery. It was the physical embodiment of my late wife. We bought that car together when I received my very first major engineering promotion over 40 years ago. It was rusted and broken when we found it sitting in a salvage yard. We spent countless weekends in the garage together, rebuilding the engine block, sanding down the damaged body, and restoring the leather interior to absolute perfect condition. Her small hands had polished that wooden steering wheel. Her bright laughter was permanently woven into the fabric of those seats. It was the only tangible piece of her beautiful soul I had left in this entire world. I had kept it covered and meticulously protected, refusing to sell it even when Sarah begged me for the money years ago. Mitchell knew exactly what that classic car meant to me. He knew it was my heart. But he also knew that a fully restored 1968 Mustang could fetch over $80,000 in pure, untraceable cash from a shady underground vehicle collector within a matter of hours. I stood up from the bedroom floor and walked out the back door toward the detached garage. The heavy metal roll-up door was wide open to the evening air. The large concrete bay was entirely empty. A single dark patch of oil stained the floor where the beautiful machine had rested safely for years. Mitchell had actually done it. In his blind, frantic panic to cover his fraudulent tracks and secure escape funds, he had crossed the final boundary of human decency. He had stolen the one thing in the world I truly loved. Most men would have fallen to the concrete floor and wept over the profound violation. Most men would have called their daughter screaming and begging for the vehicle to be returned to its rightful place. I simply stood in the empty garage, breathing in the faint, lingering smell of old motor oil and exhaust. Mitchell thought he had dealt me a devastating emotional blow. He thought he had taken my most prized possession to fund his criminal escape. He believed he was speeding away toward his financial salvation in a classic muscle car. He believed my old age made me an easy, vulnerable target for his cruelty. He did not realize that a man who spends his entire life building indestructible bridges and never leaves his most valuable asset unprotected. He did not know that his desperate act of theft was not a victory. It was the absolute final nail in his own coffin. He had just handed me the exact tool I needed to ensure he would never sleep in a comfortable bed again. I walked calmly back into my ruined guest house, pulled my cell phone from my pocket, and prepared to unleash the absolute wrath of the law upon him. I stood in the center of the empty concrete bay, letting the reality of the empty space wash over me. The faint smell of old motor oil and premium exhaust hung in the damp evening air. A lesser man would have reached for his phone immediately to call his daughter. A weaker father would have dialed Sarah's number, begging her to intervene, pleading with her to make her husband bring the car back before any real damage was done. I did not touch my phone. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly turned around and walked out of the detached garage, pulling the heavy metal door back down until it locked into place. The loud metallic clang echoed across the quiet property. I walked back toward the ruined guest house, stepping carefully over the shattered pieces of my own front door. Mitchell had ransacked my living space with the chaotic energy of a desperate animal. He had flipped my furniture, torn my books, and violated my privacy. But as I navigated the debris field he had left behind, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of clinical detachment. I walked into my bedroom and looked at the violently pried steel lockbox on the floor. Mitchell believed he had discovered my ultimate vulnerability. He believed he had found the key to his salvation hidden beneath my floorboards. What Mitchell failed to understand is that a structural engineer never leaves a critical load-bearing asset without a redundant safety mechanism. 3 days ago, before the explosive confrontation in my kitchen, before the massive banking freeze and before the forged medical documents, I had noticed something incredibly subtle. I had watched Mitchell standing in the driveway smoking an expensive cigar, staring intensely at the detached garage. I saw the distinct look of pure, greedy calculation in his eyes. He was looking at the metal door the way a starving man looks at a locked pantry. I knew instantly that if his financial house of cards ever collapsed, he would try to liquidate my vintage car to save himself. I did not confront him that day. I did not change the locks on the garage or attempt to move the vehicle to a secure storage facility. A visible defense only forces an enemy to plan a more aggressive attack. Instead, I drove the vintage vehicle to a highly specialized automotive security firm downtown. I spent $4,000 in cash to have a military-grade global positioning satellite tracker permanently welded directly into the steel undercarriage of the vehicle. This was not a cheap plastic device you buy on the internet and magnetize to a bumper. This was a completely integrated tracking unit, hardwired directly into the main electrical harness of the car. It was entirely invisible to the naked eye. Even a professional mechanic would need hours to locate it and dismantle it. I had the technicians link the encrypted signal directly to a private application on my secure tablet. I built a digital cage around my own property, and Mitchell had just voluntarily locked himself inside of it. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed the standard contacts list. I did not call Sarah. I did not call Bradley Evans. I dialed the direct emergency dispatch line for the State Highway Patrol. The phone rang exactly twice before a female dispatcher answered the call. She asked me to state the nature of my emergency. I did not sound frantic. I did not sound like a frightened elderly man whose home had just been burglarized. I spoke with the precise, measured cadence of a man reading a technical manual. I informed the dispatcher that I needed to report an active grand theft auto in progress. I told her the stolen vehicle was a fully restored 1968 classic muscle car. I provided the exact license plate number, the vehicle identification number, and the specific paint color code. The dispatcher began to run through her standard script. She asked me when I had last seen the vehicle and if I had any idea who might have taken it. I stopped her mid-sentence. I told her I knew exactly who took it, and I knew exactly where the vehicle was currently located. I walked over to my overturned kitchen table, righted a single wooden chair, and sat down. I pulled my secure digital tablet from my heavy coat pocket and activated the encrypted application. A high-resolution digital map of the entire state instantly illuminated the dark room. A bright red pulsating dot was moving rapidly down the southbound lane of the interstate highway. I read the live coordinates directly to the police dispatcher. I told her the vehicle was currently traveling south on Interstate Highway 95, approaching the county line. I gave her the exact mile marker and the estimated rate of speed based on the real-time satellite telemetry. The dispatcher paused her typing, clearly shocked by the absolute precision of the data I was providing. She asked me how I was actively tracking the stolen vehicle. I calmly explained the integrated military-grade hardware welded into the chassis. I informed her that the man driving the car was my son-in-law, and that he was currently attempting to flee the jurisdiction with stolen property valued at over $80,000. The dispatcher placed me on a brief hold while she relayed the exact coordinates to the active highway patrol units in the sector. I sat in the dark, ruined living room watching the glowing red dot move steadily across the digital map. Mitchell was driving fast. He was likely pushing the vintage engine hard, desperate to put as much distance between himself and my house as possible. He was heading straight toward the state border. If he crossed that line, it would trigger a cascade of federal interstate commerce violations, adding massive weight to his impending criminal charges. He thought he was driving toward freedom. He was actually driving himself deeper into a federal penitentiary. The dispatcher came back on the line. Her voice was sharp and fully energized. She informed me that 3 separate Highway Patrol Interceptor units had successfully picked up the satellite tracking beacon and were currently moving into a pincer formation ahead of the stolen vehicle. She told me they were going to execute a felony traffic stop within the next 4 minutes. She asked me to remain on the line to confirm the identity of the driver once the physical apprehension was complete. I agreed and placed the phone on speaker, resting it on my leg. I stared at the tablet. The red dot continued to pulse. I imagined Mitchell sitting behind the beautiful wooden steering wheel of my late wife's car, gripping it with his sweating, arrogant hands. I imagined the false sense of victory racing through his mind. He had successfully broken into my house. He had secured the ultimate prize. He probably believed he had finally beaten me. He probably believed I was sitting in this dark room weeping over my loss, too terrified and confused to take action. He had relied entirely on the stereotype of the weak, silent elderly man. My silence had never been a symptom of weakness. My silence was the necessary condition required to build an inescapable structural trap. Suddenly, the red dot on my digital map stopped moving. It did not slow down gradually. It completely halted directly in the center of the interstate highway. A few seconds later, the dispatcher's voice echoed through the speaker of my phone. She stated that the highway patrol units had successfully boxed in the stolen vehicle. She reported that the suspect had been removed from the car at gunpoint and was currently being placed in heavy steel handcuffs on the asphalt. She asked me to confirm the physical description of my son-in-law. I recited Mitchell's exact height, weight, hair color, and the expensive designer suit he was likely wearing. The dispatcher verified the information with the officers on the scene. She confirmed that the suspect was in full police custody and that the vintage vehicle had been successfully recovered without a single scratch on the paint. She told me a detective would be calling me shortly to arrange the return of the car and to take my formal statement for the prosecution. I thanked her for her precise efficiency and ended the call. The room went entirely silent again. I looked around at the destroyed furniture and the scattered papers. The physical damage to my home was irrelevant. The trap had perfectly snapped shut. Mitchell was now sitting in the back of a police cruiser, his wrists bound tightly behind his back, his entire life shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. But the chain of consequences was not yet complete. Mitchell was only half of the equation. Sarah was still sitting comfortably in the massive house I had paid for, entirely unaware that her husband had just been arrested for grand theft auto and that the federal government had frozen all of their fraudulent assets. It was time to deliver the final devastating blow. It was time to walk across the lawn, knock on the front door of the main house, and hand my daughter the itemized receipt for her absolute ruin. I sat in the darkness of my destroyed living room, waiting for the inevitable aftermath. The digital tablet on my lap had gone completely dark, but the reality of the trap I had set was just beginning to unfold. My cell phone vibrated heavily against my leg, breaking the absolute silence of the room. It was a direct call from the lead detective of the State Highway Patrol. He spoke with the gruff, heavy satisfaction of a man who had just taken a desperate criminal off the streets. He wanted to personally update me on the exact details of the felony traffic stop before the local news stations picked up the scanner chatter. The detective told me that when the interceptor units activated their emergency lights and sirens, Mitchell did not immediately pull his vehicle over to the shoulder. In his absolute blind panic, he attempted to accelerate the vintage muscle car, pushing the classic engine toward its physical limit. He tried to weave through heavy interstate traffic, attempting to reach an upcoming exit. The detective explained that Mitchell was heading directly for an industrial district known for housing illegal vehicle dismantling operations, commonly referred to as chop shops. He intended to trade my priceless vehicle for pennies on the dollar to secure immediate, untraceable escape funds. But Mitchell was an arrogant corporate coward, not a professional getaway driver. He did not possess the skill to control a heavy rear-wheel drive machine at those extreme speeds. The Highway Patrol executed a highly coordinated tactical maneuver. They boxed him in against the concrete median barrier and forced the vehicle to a complete halt without inflicting a single scratch on the pristine bodywork. The detective told me Mitchell locked the doors and stubbornly refused to exit the vehicle. He rolled up the windows and ignored the direct lawful orders of the armed officers. The police had to shatter the driver's side window with a steel baton. They drew their service weapons, reached inside the cabin, and physically dragged Mitchell out onto the rough asphalt. Mitchell had screamed and thrashed violently, threatening to sue the entire police department. He screamed that he was a wealthy, respected financial executive and that they were making a massive mistake. The officers responded by planting a heavy knee firmly into his spine and securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The detective assured me that Mitchell was currently sitting in a cold concrete holding cell at the county jail. He was facing multiple severe felony charges, including grand theft auto, fleeing and eluding law enforcement, and violently resisting arrest. The classic car was being carefully loaded onto a flatbed transport truck and taken to a highly secure indoor impound facility where I could retrieve it tomorrow morning. I thanked the detective for his precise professional work and ended the call. The silence returned to my ruined guest house, but it lasted for less than 10 minutes. I heard the frantic, chaotic sound of high heels clicking rapidly against the concrete walkway outside. The broken front door was suddenly pushed all the way open, hitting the interior wall with a loud thud. Sarah stood in the doorway. She was an absolute vision of total collapse. The entitled, arrogant woman who had stood in my kitchen just yesterday demanding my pension money was completely gone. Her expensive designer jacket was improperly buttoned and hanging off her shoulder. Her carefully styled hair was a messy, tangled disaster. Thick black makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, ugly streams. She was frantically clutching her cell phone to her chest, as if her life depended on it. She took one trembling step into the ruined living room and saw the overturned furniture, the shattered wood, and the scattered debris. She did not even register the fact that her husband was the one who had violently destroyed my home. She threw herself onto her knees right in the center of the torn paper and broken glass. She began to sob uncontrollably, the sound echoing loudly off the bare walls. It was not a quiet, dignified, emotional release. It was the loud, ugly wailing of a woman who had just watched her entire privileged existence evaporate into thin air. She looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes and told me Mitchell had just called her from the county jail using his single allotted phone call. She choked on her own tears as she explained that the local magistrate had denied him immediate bail because he was considered a severe flight risk after attempting to outrun the highway patrol units. Sarah crawled across the messy floor toward my wooden chair, reaching out with shaking hands to grab the fabric of my pant leg. She begged me to pick up my phone and call the police station right now. She pleaded with me to tell the lead detective that it was all a terrible family misunderstanding. She wanted me to lie to the state authorities. She wanted me to officially declare that I had freely given Mitchell the keys to the vintage vehicle and that he had my full legal permission to drive it across the state line. She promised me that if I called the police and dropped the grand theft auto charges, they would never bother me about my monthly pension money ever again. She swore they would completely abandon the fake conservatorship petition tomorrow morning. She looked frantically around the destroyed room and promised to buy me all new expensive furniture and hire a professional construction crew to repair my front door. She tried to invoke the sacred memory of her late mother, begging me to show mercy for the sake of our family legacy. She cried that Mitchell would immediately lose his high-paying corporate job if he caught a felony conviction and that his professional reputation in the financial sector would be permanently ruined. She told me she simply could not survive the social humiliation of being married to a convicted felon in front of all her wealthy friends. Every single word falling out of her mouth was entirely focused on her own comfort, her own social standing, and her own financial security. She did not offer a single genuine apology for the forged medical documents, the stolen pension money, or the profound disrespect they had shown me for the last 3 years. I looked down at my daughter crying on the floor. I did not reach out to touch her shoulder. I did not offer her a tissue to wipe her ruined face. I sat perfectly still in my chair and let her tears fall onto my leather shoes. I told her to let go of my clothes immediately. My voice was completely flat and utterly devoid of any paternal warmth. Sarah flinched violently at the absolute coldness in my tone and slowly pulled her hands back, holding them against her chest. I pointed a single finger toward the twisted steel lockbox resting on the floor of my bedroom, visible through the open doorway. I told her that her husband had violently broken into my private sanctuary and stolen the only physical memory I had left of the woman who gave birth to her. I told her that Mitchell had not simply borrowed a car for a joyride. He had deliberately stolen an $80,000 liquid asset to fund his escape from federal justice. I watched a sudden wave of deep confusion wash over her tear-stained face. She stopped crying for a fraction of a second. She asked me what I meant by federal justice. I realized in that exact moment that Mitchell had not told her the entire truth during his frantic phone call from the holding cell. He had been too ashamed or perhaps too terrified to confess his ultimate failure. He had not told her about the frozen bank accounts or the failed offshore wire transfer. I leaned forward in my chair and looked directly into Sarah's terrified eyes. I told her I was not going to make a single phone call to save him. I told her the grand theft auto charge was completely legitimate, and I would be proudly testifying against him in open court. But I did not stop there. I reached onto the small side table next to me and picked up the heavy black binder. I pulled out the certified forensic audit of the forged home equity loan. I dropped the heavy stack of legal documents directly onto the floor in front of her. I informed her that her husband was not just a car thief. I told her he had secretly forged my signature to take out a $300,000 fraudulent loan against the very house she was currently living in. I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror as she stared at the highlighted bank statements. I told her that federal investigators were currently auditing every single transaction Mitchell had ever made, and that all of their shared bank accounts were permanently frozen by the United States government. I told her that Mitchell was not coming home tomorrow or the next day. He was going to federal prison for a very long time. I ordered her to get off my floor and go back to her massive house to pack her designer bags, because very soon she was not going to have a roof over her head. Sarah stared at the heavy stack of legal documents resting on the torn carpet of my ruined living room. The thick black binder I had dropped at her feet seemed to radiate a terrifying gravity. She slowly reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the top page. It was the certified forensic audit of the $300,000 home equity line of credit. I watched her perfectly manicured nails scrape against the paper as her eyes darted back and forth across the dense financial text. She did not understand the complex banking terminology, but she absolutely recognized the address printed at the top of the loan agreement. It was the address of the massive property she had lived in for the past 15 years. It was the address of her supposed forever home. I broke the silence with a voice so calm it sounded like a judge reading a final verdict. I told her that while she was busy planning to lock me away in a state-run psychiatric ward, her husband was busy mortgaging the very ground she walked on. She shook her head violently side to side, attempting to physically reject the reality printed in black ink. She stammered that there must be a mistake and that Mitchell would never take out a loan without telling her. I told her to turn to the third page of the document and look at the bottom right corner. She flipped the heavy paper over and stared at the signature line. I asked her if that looked like my handwriting. I reminded her that I had spent my entire adult life drafting precise structural engineering blueprints, and that my personal signature was a rigidly uniform block of text. The signature on that banking document was a sloppy, chaotic imitation. I told her that Mitchell had deliberately forged my name to bypass the deed restrictions. He had committed aggravated identity theft to steal $300,000 of my hard-earned equity, and he had used her house as the direct collateral. The color completely drained from Sarah's face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She dropped the papers back onto the floor, as if they were physically burning her hands. I did not give her a single moment to catch her breath. I continued laying out the exact dimensions of the trap her husband had built for them. I informed her that the federal government does not take kindly to massive domestic bank fraud. I explained that my attorney Bradley Evans had already contacted the Federal Wire Fraud Division this afternoon. I told her that federal agents had successfully intercepted an international wire transfer Mitchell attempted to send to the Cayman Islands just a few hours ago. He was trying to launder the stolen equity out of the country and leave her entirely alone to face the catastrophic financial fallout. I told her that right now federal investigators were actively auditing every single bank account attached to Mitchell's Social Security number. The joint checking accounts, the luxury credit cards, the mutual funds she thought secured her wealthy lifestyle were all permanently frozen under federal authority. I watched the exact moment her mind comprehended the absolute totality of her ruin. The arrogant facade she had worn for years shattered completely, revealing the absolute selfish cowardice underneath. She did not express horror at what Mitchell had done to me. She did not apologize for my stolen pension or my forged signature. Her survival instinct kicked in, and it was entirely focused on preserving herself at any cost. She fell back onto her knees and grabbed my hands. Her grip was painfully tight. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes and immediately began to rewrite history. She started throwing the man she had been married to for a decade directly under the bus. She cried out that she had absolutely no idea about the forged loan or the offshore bank accounts. She swore on her life that Mitchell handled all of their finances and that he kept her completely in the dark. She claimed he was a manipulative monster who controlled every aspect of her existence. She pointed toward the splintered front door and the overturned furniture in my living room, using his violent burglary as proof of his unhinged criminal nature. She sobbed heavily, claiming she was just as much of a victim as I was. She begged me to call my expensive attorney and have him represent her in the divorce proceedings. She wanted me to use my wealth to shield her from the federal investigators. She promised she would testify against Mitchell in federal court and tell the judge whatever I wanted her to say, as long as I protected her from going to prison and allowed her to stay in the main house. She continued her frantic, pathetic monologue, trying to weaponize my memories of her childhood. She reminded me of the days we used to spend together when she was a little girl before she met Mitchell. She claimed Mitchell had slowly poisoned her mind against me over the years, convincing her that I was a burden. She wept loudly, insisting that deep down she had always loved me, and that she had only gone along with the conservatorship plan because Mitchell threatened to leave her if she refused. She painted a picture of herself as a helpless, terrified hostage trapped in a marriage with a financial predator. She thought she could manipulate the innate protective instinct a father has for his daughter. She thought my love for her would override my logic and blind me to her obvious complicity. I looked down at the woman who shared my DNA and felt a profound, sickening disappointment. I pulled my hands out of her desperate grip and stood up from my wooden chair. I walked over to the destroyed kitchen area and picked up one of the dented cans of generic chicken soup Mitchell had knocked onto the floor. I walked back and held the cheap aluminum can directly in front of her face. I asked her if Mitchell had also forced her to feed me garbage while my pension deposited $5,500 into her account every single month. I asked her if Mitchell had somehow brainwashed her into standing in my kitchen yesterday afternoon, eagerly nodding along while he threatened to lock me in a heavily medicated nursing facility. I reminded her that she had looked me dead in the eye and told me my mind was failing. She had weaponized my age against me for her own financial gain. She had willingly participated in the psychological torture required to set up the fake conservatorship. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at the soup can, her lips trembling. I told her that true victims do not wear expensive diamond tennis bracelets purchased with stolen health insurance funds. I told her that true victims do not smirk when their elderly father is threatened with forced institutionalization. I explained that I had spent 40 years building strong foundations for bridges and buildings, but I had clearly failed to build a strong moral foundation for my own child. I told her she was not a victim of Mitchell's greed. She was an active, enthusiastic partner in it. She had loved the lavish lifestyle, the luxury cars, and the expensive vacations far more than she had ever loved me. She was perfectly willing to let Mitchell destroy my life, as long as she got to keep living in a massive house without ever having to work for it. She began to weep again loudly and pathetically, wrapping her arms around her own stomach. She begged me to forgive her. She pleaded for a second chance, crying that she was still my little girl and that family was supposed to stick together through difficult times. The sheer hypocrisy of her words hung heavily in the cold evening air. I told her that family is defined by mutual respect and basic human decency, not by shared blood. I told her I would not be calling Bradley Evans to help her with a divorce. I would not be using a single dime of my protected wealth to hire her a defense attorney. I told her that when the federal agents arrived to question her about the stolen $300,000, she would have to face them entirely on her own. I advised her to tell them the absolute truth, because lying to a federal investigator carries a 5-year mandatory prison sentence. She slowly stood up from the floor, wiping the smeared makeup from her eyes. She looked around my ruined guest house one last time, her shoulders completely slumped in total defeat. She whispered that she had nowhere else to go. She said her credit cards were already declining, and she had absolutely zero cash to her name. She said she would just go back to the main house, lock the doors, and figure out how to survive without Mitchell. She thought the main house was still her ultimate sanctuary. She thought she still had a roof over her head, even if it was burdened by a massive fraudulent bank lien. She turned around and began to walk slowly toward the broken front door, dragging her feet like a condemned prisoner. She had absolutely no idea that the ground she was walking on no longer belonged to her. She had no idea that I was about to drop the final devastating piece of the structural collapse directly onto her head. Sarah reached the broken doorframe and placed her hand on the splintered wood. She let out a long, trembling breath, believing the absolute worst of her nightmare was finally over. She truly believed that she could simply walk across the manicured lawn, unlock the heavy oak front door of the main house, and collapse into her expensive king-sized bed. She believed that even though her husband was sitting in a concrete jail cell and her bank accounts were frozen by the federal government, she still possessed a fortress. She thought she still had the physical walls, the granite countertops, the heated swimming pool, and the social status that came with living in a massive suburban estate. She had spent her entire adult life wrapping her identity in the expensive architecture of that house. She was entirely oblivious to the fundamental engineering reality that a house is nothing more than a temporary arrangement of wood and glass resting on top of the only thing that actually holds permanent value. I did not raise my voice as I watched her prepare to leave my ruined guest house. I simply spoke her name into the cold evening air. She stopped and turned her head slightly, looking back at me over her trembling shoulder. I told her she was forgetting a critical detail about the physical property she was currently trying to retreat toward. I reminded her that 15 years ago, when I walked into the real estate office and wrote a massive cashier's check to purchase that estate, I did not buy it because I was impressed by the interior decorating. I am a structural engineer. I do not look at cosmetic finishes or expensive lighting fixtures. I look at the dirt. I look at the foundation. I look at the municipal infrastructure surrounding the perimeter. I told her that when I bought that house, I deliberately targeted a 2-acre parcel sitting directly adjacent to a rapidly expanding municipal transit corridor. Sarah turned fully around, facing me again, with a look of profound confusion settling over her tear-stained features. She did not understand why I was talking about municipal transit or dirt. I explained it to her in the simplest terms possible. I told her that she and Mitchell had spent the last 15 years living inside a house that was sitting on land legally zoned for heavy commercial use. They had never bothered to look at the county zoning maps or the long-term city development plans. They were too busy throwing expensive dinner parties and buying luxury vehicles to realize they were sleeping in the exact center of a highly coveted commercial retail district. I watched her eyes blink rapidly as her exhausted mind struggled to process the information. I told her that for the past 5 years, I had been receiving weekly phone calls and aggressive certified letters from massive national corporate real estate developers. They desperately wanted to purchase the 2-acre parcel. They wanted to tear down her beautiful house and pave over her heated swimming pool to build a massive commercial retail complex. I explained that for 5 years, I had firmly rejected every single multi-million-dollar corporate buyout offer. I had left millions of dollars sitting on the table simply because I wanted my daughter to have a comfortable, beautiful place to live. I had protected her sanctuary from the corporate bulldozers out of pure, blind, paternal love. I paused and let the absolute silence of the room stretch out between us for several long seconds. I wanted her to fully grasp the magnitude of the sacrifice I had made for her before I revealed exactly how I had finally chosen to revoke it. I told her that yesterday morning after I left the bank where I permanently closed my pension account, and before Mitchell kicked open my front door, I made a second stop. I did not drive home to argue. I drove directly to the downtown corporate offices of the largest commercial retail developer in the state. I walked into their executive boardroom and informed their lead acquisitions director that I was finally ready to accept their standing offer. Sarah's jaw dropped open. Her breath caught in her throat, producing a sickening, choking sound. She took a single unsteady step back toward the broken doorframe, her hands reaching out blindly to grab the wall for physical support. I told her I sat at a massive glass conference table and signed the master deed transfer I sold the entire 2-acre parcel of dirt right out from under her feet for a massive sum of commercial cash. I told her the transaction was completely legal, entirely finalized, and completely irreversible. The ground she was currently standing on no longer belonged to me, and it certainly no longer belonged to her. It belonged to a ruthless multi-billion-dollar corporate retail conglomerate. She began to shake her head violently side to side, muttering the word no over and over again in a frantic, breathless whisper. She tried to find a logical flaw in my statement. She tried to use the fraudulent loan to her advantage. She stammered that I could not possibly sell the house because Mitchell had just placed a $300,000 bank lien against the title. She thought the very crime her husband committed would somehow accidentally protect her from being evicted. She thought the bank would block the corporate sale. I looked at her and smiled a cold, devastating smile. I explained that a retail conglomerate building a $50 million commercial center employs an army of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the country. I told her that when their legal team discovered the active bank lien during their expedited morning title search, they did not cancel the real estate purchase. They simply contacted the federal authorities and the bank directly. They used my certified medical affidavit and the obvious forensic proof of Mitchell's forgery to legally nullify the bank's claim to the physical property. The corporate lawyers completely crushed the local bank, forcing them to remove the lien from the physical dirt. The bank is now forced to collect their stolen $300,000 directly from Mitchell's frozen offshore accounts and his personal future earnings. The land itself was immediately transferred to the developer entirely free and clear of any financial encumbrance. Sarah stared at me, her entire body trembling violently. The final illusion of her perfect, wealthy life was rapidly dissolving into absolute nothingness right in front of her eyes. She was finally realizing that she had absolutely nothing left to fall back on. Her husband was a federal criminal sitting in a concrete cell. Her shared bank accounts were seized by the United States government. Her credit was entirely destroyed. And now the massive, beautiful house she thought she owned was nothing more than a temporary structure waiting to be violently erased from the map. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat one final time. I pulled out a single crisp piece of white paper. It was not a bank statement or a forensic audit. It was a formal, legally binding corporate document. I walked slowly across the debris-covered floor and held the paper out to her. She did not raise her hands to take it. She just stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. I read the heavy black text printed at the top of the page out loud. It was a mandatory 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I told her the retail developer was not interested in becoming a residential landlord. They were not going to let her rent the house or negotiate a temporary lease. They wanted the dirt, and they wanted it immediately. I informed her that she had exactly 30 days to pack her designer clothes, her expensive shoes, and whatever worthless items she could carry. I told her that on the morning of the 31st day, a fleet of heavy industrial bulldozers and demolition excavators would arrive at the end of the driveway. They were going to smash through the heavy oak front door, crush the granite countertops, and grind the heated swimming pool into dust. They were going to completely level the entire property and pave a commercial parking lot directly over the exact spot where her bedroom currently sat. The sound that erupted from Sarah's throat was not a standard human cry. It was a raw, visceral, tearing scream of absolute psychological destruction. It was the sound of a woman plummeting headfirst into an endless dark abyss. She dropped to her knees on the splintered wood of the entryway, clutching her head in her hands, wailing with a terrifying, agonizing intensity. She had spent her entire adult life looking down on people who struggled, believing her wealth and her status made her completely invincible. She had treated me like a disposable nuisance, a broken old man who existed only to fund her lavish arrogance. Now she was kneeling in the dirt, with absolutely $0 to her name, facing imminent homelessness and absolute public ruin. I looked down at her crying form and felt absolutely no pity. I had given her a fortress, and she had chosen to invite a parasite inside to slowly devour the foundation. She had chosen to smile, while her husband threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward. She had made her choice, and now she was simply experiencing the flawless mathematical consequence of a structural collapse. I stepped carefully around. Her trembling body walked out the broken front door and stepped into the cool evening air, leaving her entirely alone in the darkness to face the absolute devastation she had so eagerly helped create. The heavy mahogany doors of the county courthouse felt like the gates to an inevitable mathematical conclusion. I walked through the metal detectors at 8 o'clock in the morning, feeling the cold, polished marble floor beneath my shoes. I was wearing my best tailored charcoal suit, the one I had originally purchased for my late wife's funeral. I wore it today, not to mourn, but to bury the man who had tried to destroy my life. Bradley Evans walked confidently beside me, carrying his thick leather briefcase like an executioner's axe. The hallways were crowded with frantic people, weeping families, and overworked public defenders shouting over the chaotic noise. I felt absolutely no anxiety. A structural engineer knows that once the demolition charges are perfectly placed inside a condemned building, the actual collapse is simply a matter of gravity. Today, we were going to pull the final trigger. We entered courtroom number 4 and took our seats in the second row of the heavy wooden gallery benches. The air inside the room was stale and smelled faintly of floor wax and nervous sweat. I sat with my hands folded, resting on my lap, staring straight ahead at the raised judicial bench. 10 minutes later, the heavy side door connected to the holding cells swung open. A line of inmates shuffled into the room, bound together by thick steel chains around their waists and ankles. My eyes immediately locked onto the third man in the line. It was Mitchell. The arrogant corporate executive who had kicked down my front door just a few days ago was completely unrecognizable. He was wearing a violently bright orange county jail jumpsuit that hung loosely off his shoulders. His expensive haircut was a greasy, tangled mess. His face was pale and covered in a dark layer of coarse stubble. The reality of a cold concrete cell had entirely stripped away his polished financial armor. Mitchell scanned the gallery with frantic, terrified eyes until he saw me sitting next to Bradley. A sudden flash of pure, desperate hatred crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a pathetic look of victimhood. The bailiff ordered the inmates to sit on the designated wooden bench along the wall. The judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair and a completely exhausted expression, took his seat at the top of the bench and slammed his wooden gavel. He began calling the docket cases one by one. I watched Mitchell nervously tapping his chained hands against his knees. He was entirely alone. Sarah was nowhere to be found in the courtroom gallery. She had completely abandoned him the moment she realized his financial empire had collapsed. When the clerk finally called Mitchell's name, he stood up awkwardly, the heavy metal chains clanking loudly in the quiet room. A young, exhausted public defender stepped up to the podium to stand beside him. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive file sitting on his desk. He read the preliminary charges out loud into the microphone. Grand theft auto, fleeing and eluding law enforcement, and violently resisting a lawful arrest. The judge asked the public defender how his client wished to plead to the arraignment charges. Before the young lawyer could even open his mouth to speak, Mitchell committed the ultimate courtroom sin. He forcefully shoved his public defender aside and leaned directly into the microphone. His voice echoed through the high ceilings, shrill and completely unhinged. He loudly declared that the entire situation was a massive family misunderstanding. He pointed a shaking, chained finger directly at me, sitting quietly in the gallery. Mitchell told the judge that he was not a criminal, but a dedicated son-in-law trying to protect his sick elderly father. He lied with the practiced ease of a corporate sociopath. He claimed that I had voluntarily given him the keys to the vintage muscle car as an early birthday present weeks ago. He swore to the court that my mind was rapidly deteriorating and that I had simply forgotten about the gift in a state of severe age-related confusion. He dramatically begged the judge to dismiss the grand theft auto charges immediately. He did not stop there. He attempted to execute the very threat he had made in my kitchen. He formally requested that the judge order an emergency psychiatric hold on me right there in the courtroom. He claimed he possessed a sworn medical affidavit proving my advanced dementia and demanded that the court immediately grant him temporary conservatorship over my estate to protect my assets from my own insanity. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The judge lowered his reading glasses, staring at Mitchell with a look of deep, skeptical scrutiny. He then looked over at me, sitting perfectly still next to my attorney. Bradley Evans did not wait for an invitation to speak. He stood up from the wooden bench, smoothed the front of his expensive suit jacket, and walked past the wooden swinging gate into the central well of the courtroom. He introduced himself to the judge as my retained legal counsel. Bradley spoke with a voice so calm and authoritative that it completely commanded the attention of every single person in the room. He told the judge that the defendant was indeed correct about one single fact. There was a medical document regarding my cognitive health. Bradley opened his leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, sealed envelope from the State Supreme Court Medical Board. He walked forward and handed it directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. Bradley respectfully asked the judge to review the certified results of the 4-hour intensive psychological and cognitive evaluation I had completed just 72 hours ago. He stated clearly, for the official court record, that I had scored in the 99th percentile for spatial reasoning logic and memory retention. He formally declared that the state-appointed medical board had legally certified me as completely mentally sound and entirely competent. I watched Mitchell's pale face turn the color of wet ash. He stared at the thick white envelope in the judge's hands, realizing that his ultimate trump card had just been completely incinerated. The judge broke the seal and quickly scanned the official document, noting the 3 specialized doctor signatures and the raised state seal. The judge's expression shifted from exhausted skepticism to pure, concentrated anger. He looked down at Mitchell and asked him very quietly if he was in the habit of lying to a sitting magistrate in open court. Mitchell began to stammer, stepping back from the microphone, his heavy chains rattling as panic completely overtook his nervous system. Bradley did not give Mitchell a single second to recover his balance. He turned to the judge and delivered the final devastating blow. Bradley stated that the defendant was not just lying about a stolen vehicle to avoid a local felony conviction. Bradley informed the court that the defendant was currently the primary target of an active, massive federal bank fraud investigation. Bradley pulled out the certified forensic audit of the forged home equity line of credit and the printed alert of the failed offshore wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. He requested permission to submit the documents into evidence for the bail hearing. The judge immediately granted the request. Bradley explained the entire structural reality of Mitchell's criminal enterprise to the court. He detailed how Mitchell had forged my signature to steal $300,000 of my personal equity. He explained how Mitchell had attempted to launder those stolen funds to an untraceable offshore account just hours before he forcefully broke into my home to steal a classic vehicle valued at $80,000. Bradley painted a flawless, undeniable picture of a desperate man whose financial crimes were catching up to him. He argued that Mitchell stealing the car and attempting to flee from the highway patrol was a direct, calculated flight response to his failing offshore wire transfer. Bradley looked directly at the judge and delivered his final legal recommendation. He stated that a man facing decades in federal prison for aggravated identity theft and massive bank fraud, who had already demonstrated a violent willingness to flee from state law enforcement, and who possessed established connections to international offshore banking, could never be trusted to return for trial. Bradley formally requested that the court deny all forms of bail and remand the defendant to the county jail until his federal indictment was officially processed. Mitchell began to scream. He thrashed against his heavy chains, screaming that the documents were fake and that Bradley was framing him. He yelled that he was a wealthy executive and demanded to be released immediately so he could go back to his massive house and his wife. He was completely delusional, unable to process the absolute finality of his own destruction. The two large bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing Mitchell by the shoulders and physically restraining him against the heavy wooden podium. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down so hard, the sound echoed like a gunshot. The judge ordered Mitchell to be absolutely silent or face an additional charge of contempt of court. The judge looked down at the forged banking documents and the certified medical affidavit. He looked at me sitting quietly in the gallery, recognizing the quiet dignity of a man who had simply refused to be a victim. The judge then looked at Mitchell with an expression of absolute disgust. The judge leaned directly into his microphone and delivered the final, undeniable consequence. He stated that based on the irrefutable evidence of severe federal financial crimes, the violent nature of the physical arrest, and the undeniable flight risk posed by the defendant's own actions, he was officially declaring Mitchell an extreme danger to the community and a catastrophic flight risk. The judge slammed the gavel down one final time. He revoked Mitchell's bail entirely and ordered him to be held in maximum security county lockup without the possibility of bond until his trial date. The bailiffs immediately dragged Mitchell away from the podium. He did not walk, he was physically hauled backward toward the heavy steel holding cell door. He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes wide with absolute bottomless terror, as the reality of his future finally crushed him. He was not going back to his granite countertops or his luxury vehicles. He was going to spend the next several years in a tiny concrete cage. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his frantic screams entirely. I sat in the wooden pew, taking a slow, deep breath. The legal foundation of his life was completely demolished. Now there was only one loose end left to tie up before I could finally walk away entirely free. I stood up, buttoned my charcoal suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom, with my attorney ready to watch the final walls come crashing down on my ungrateful daughter. The 30 days expired exactly as I promised they would. On the morning of the 31st day, I parked my car across the street from the massive suburban estate I had once purchased for my daughter. The sun was barely rising over the horizon, but the quiet neighborhood was already completely awake. A convoy of heavy yellow industrial machinery was lined up along the curb. Massive bulldozers, excavators, and a commercial wrecking crew stood idling in the crisp morning air, their diesel engines rumbling with the promise of absolute destruction. A team of corporate lawyers in sharp suits stood at the end of the driveway, holding clipboards and the final writ of possession. The retail conglomerate did not operate on emotional timelines. They operated on strict financial schedules, and today was demolition day. I watched the heavy oak front door swing open. Sarah stumbled out onto the front porch, looking entirely disoriented and completely terrified. She had spent the last 30 days living in a state of deep denial, hoping the bank would miraculously save her, or that I would suddenly change my mind and cancel the corporate sale. But there was no salvation coming. The lead corporate attorney walked up the driveway and handed her the final eviction order. He calmly informed her that she had exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises before the demolition crew breached the structural walls. Sarah ran back inside the house in a blind, frantic panic. Because Mitchell's federal fraud charges had permanently frozen every single bank account attached to their names, Sarah had no access to liquid cash. She could not hire a professional moving company to carefully pack her expensive crystal or transport her heavy luxury furniture. She could not even afford to buy basic cardboard boxes. I watched from across the street as she began dragging heavy black plastic garbage bags out the front door and dumping them unceremoniously onto the front lawn. She was frantically stuffing thousands of dollars worth of designer dresses, custom shoes, and expensive leather handbags into cheap disposable trash bags. The wealthy neighbors she used to host for lavish dinner parties were now standing on their porches, watching her public humiliation unfold in real time. The wealthy socialite who used to mock my simple lifestyle was now sweating profusely, hauling garbage bags across the manicured grass, while the demolition crew watched her with bored indifference. When the 1 hour deadline expired, The foreman blew a loud air horn. The heavy yellow excavators began rolling up the driveway, their massive steel treads crushing the pristine landscaping. Sarah stood on the public sidewalk surrounded by a mountain of black plastic bags. She watched as the first excavator raised its massive steel claw and drove it straight through the front window of her expensive living room. The sound of shattering glass and tearing wood echoed through the neighborhood. The fortress she had used to justify her arrogance was violently reduced to a pile of worthless rubble in less than 20 minutes. I started my car engine and drove away, leaving her standing in the dust. 2 hours later, she called me from a borrowed cell phone begging for one final meeting. I agreed to meet her at a cheap diner on the edge of the city. When she walked through the glass doors of the restaurant, she looked like a completely broken woman. Her designer clothes were covered in gray drywall dust. Her face was hollow and exhausted. She slid into the vinyl booth across from me and stared at her hands. The woman who once demanded a $10,000 cash deposit for a new luxury car was now sitting in a greasy diner begging for basic shelter. She did not offer a grand apology this time. She had finally run out of lies and manipulations. She simply looked up at me with empty, defeated eyes and begged for a loan. She whispered that she had managed to drag her trash bags to a cheap motel down the street, but she only had enough cash in her pocket to pay for 2 nights. She pleaded with me to lend her just $3,000 to secure a basic lease on a small 1-bedroom apartment. She promised she would find a job and pay me back every single cent. She swore she had learned her lesson and that she just needed a tiny bit of help to survive the winter. She looked at me with the desperate, pleading expression of a starving animal hoping the father she had betrayed would offer her a final lifeline. I looked at my daughter sitting across the sticky diner table. I remembered the 3 years I spent living in her guest house. I remembered the absolute humiliation of asking her for basic groceries while she drained my monthly pension to fund her luxury vacations. I remembered opening my pantry to find 3 dented cans of generic soup. I did not raise my voice or offer a long, emotional lecture. I calmly reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my leather wallet. I extracted a single crisp $20 bill. I placed the green paper flat on the table and slowly slid it across the surface until it touched her trembling fingertips. I looked directly into her eyes and told her that this was exactly the amount of money she deemed sufficient for my weekly survival. I told her that when she was in total control of my finances, she decided my comfort and my dignity were only worth $20 a week. I told her I was simply matching her standard of care. I stood up from the booth, adjusted my coat, and told her to spend the money wisely because the gravy train had permanently derailed. I turned my back on her and walked out of the diner, leaving her sitting alone, staring at the $20 bill that represented the absolute totality of her remaining wealth. The federal sentencing took place 3 months later in a heavily guarded courtroom located in the center of the financial district. I sat in the very back row wearing my dark tailored suit and watched the final calculations of justice permanently balance themselves out. Mitchell stood before the federal magistrate completely stripped of his arrogant corporate armor. His expensive tailored suits and silk ties had been permanently replaced by the rough, scratchy fabric of a standard-issue bright orange county jail uniform. His hands and ankles were bound in heavy steel chains that rattled loudly every time he shifted his weight. The judge read the formal federal indictment aloud for the official public record. The list of crimes was extensive and undeniable. The judge detailed the massive domestic bank fraud, the aggravated identity theft, and the highly violent attempted escape from state highway patrol officers. There was absolutely no leniency offered to a man who had attempted to steal an elderly man's life savings and launder it to the Cayman Islands. The judge struck the heavy wooden block with his gavel and handed down a mandatory sentence of 7 full years in a high-security federal penitentiary. The judge also ordered full financial restitution, ensuring that Mitchell's wages would be garnished for the rest of his natural life upon his eventual release. He would never work in the financial sector again. He would be a convicted felon forever. I watched the armed federal marshals grab him by the shoulders and lead him through the heavy wooden side door toward the transport buses. He did not look back at me. I did not smile. I did not feel the sudden rush of vindictive triumph that men in movies often experience. I simply felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of watching a fundamentally broken structure safely demolished before it could cause any further collateral damage to the public. Sarah did not attend her husband's federal sentencing hearing. She was miles away, living the exact reality she had so carelessly tried to force upon me. My attorney, Bradley Evans, provided me with a final, comprehensive status update regarding her situation before officially closing my legal case file. Sarah was currently residing in a small, dimly lit room at a cheap highway motel on the far industrial edge of the county line. The entitled woman who used to loudly complain about the specific temperature of her heated swimming pool was now sharing a broken communal laundry machine and sleeping on a sagging mattress that smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. She was entirely and permanently cut off from the massive wealth she had attempted to steal. The luxury vehicles had been swiftly repossessed by the bank. Her designer clothes and expensive jewelry were slowly being sold to local pawn shops just to cover the weekly cost of her motel rent and basic generic groceries. Bradley informed me she had recently secured entry-level employment, working the late evening shift at a local discount retail store. She was finally learning the true heavy value of $1 by standing on a concrete floor for 8 hours a day, dealing with rude customers and a strict, unforgiving store manager. I knew that every single time she looked at her meager minimum wage paycheck, she would immediately remember the single $20 bill I had slid across the sticky diner table. She had willingly traded a father who loved her and a multi-million-dollar private estate for a greedy, arrogant criminal who ultimately left her with absolutely nothing. I did not feel the need to drive past her motel to gloat. I did not send her a mocking letter. I was a man who had completely severed a toxic, infected limb from his own body. I was simply moving forward with my life. I returned to my property one final time. The massive suburban estate was entirely gone. The commercial retail developers had worked with terrifying mechanical efficiency. The ground where the main house once stood was now a perfectly leveled expanse of flattened dirt and heavy crushed gravel waiting for the concrete foundation of a massive new shopping center. I walked into the small, ruined guest house and looked at the broken front door and the overturned furniture Mitchell had destroyed. I did not bother trying to repair the physical damage. I did not pack the old heavy engineering textbooks or the cheap ceramic coffee mugs. I opened a thick leather duffel bag and packed only what truly mattered. I packed my best clothes, my passport, and the original leather key fob to my late wife's pristine vintage muscle car, which was now resting safely in a high-security, climate-controlled storage facility downtown. I zipped the bag shut and walked out of the guest house for the very last time. I did not look back at the empty property as the hired car drove me away. I instructed the driver to take me directly to the international airport. I walked up to the premium service counter and handed the ticketing agent my passport. I had spent 40 long years saving my money, investing wisely, and sacrificing my own personal comfort for the sake of my family. The time for endless sacrifice was officially over. I purchased a first-class one-way ticket to Rome. The experience of walking onto that massive airplane was unlike anything I had ever felt in my entire 69 years of life. I settled into the wide, luxurious leather seat of the private first-class cabin. A flight attendant with a warm, genuine smile brought me a steaming hot towel and a crystal glass of sparkling water. As the massive jet engines roared to life and lifted the heavy aircraft off the runway, I looked out the small window at the sprawling city shrinking rapidly below me. I was leaving behind the bitter betrayal, the blind greed, and the exhausting legal battles. I was leaving behind a daughter who had chosen to view my quiet kindness as a pathetic weakness. I was flying directly toward an entirely blank canvas. I drank a cup of dark, rich coffee as we crossed the vast blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. I spent the entire 10-hour flight reading a brilliant historical novel and sleeping peacefully without a single anxious thought about frozen bank accounts or pending court dates. When we finally landed in Italy, the warm, golden Mediterranean air greeted me like an old, familiar friend. I did not book a temporary hotel room. I had already authorized my wealth management firm to purchase a beautiful, secluded stone villa, nestled high in the rolling green hills of the Tuscan countryside. A private driver met me at the airport terminal and drove me through miles of ancient silver olive groves and vibrant sunlit vineyards. The ancient architecture of the Italian region spoke directly to my deep engineering soul. I saw massive stone bridges and tall arched aqueducts that had stood completely intact for over 2,000 years. They were built on solid, unyielding foundations, crafted by brilliant men who fundamentally understood the absolute value of permanent structural strength. We arrived at my new private home just as the bright evening sun began to set behind the distant mountains. The villa was incredibly magnificent. It featured thick, heavy stone walls, dark oak ceiling beams, and tall, spotless glass windows that offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the ancient valley below. The property was completely isolated, far away from the loud noise and the chaotic, demanding pressure of modern society. I carried my single leather bag inside and walked directly out onto the wide stone terrace. The cool evening air was crisp and smelled heavily of crushed sweet grapes and wild blooming lavender. I walked over to a small, heavy wooden table and poured myself a large glass of vintage red wine from a locally sourced bottle. I held the heavy crystal glass up to the fading sunlight, watching the deep, rich ruby color perfectly catch the fading light. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The taste was incredibly rich, highly complex, and absolutely perfect. I sat down in a comfortable woven chair and listened to the natural environment surrounding me. There were no arrogant sons-in-law demanding my money or threatening my freedom. There were no ungrateful daughters complaining about the temperature of their luxury vehicles. There were no empty threats, no legal ultimatums, and absolutely no lies. There was only the gentle, soothing sound of the evening wind moving quietly through the old olive trees and the distant rhythmic chirping of the night crickets. The silence inside my beautiful empty home was absolute and profound. It was not the cold, terrifying silence of a forgotten old man waiting to die in a ruined guest house. It was the warm, golden silence of a resilient man who had successfully defended his own life and secured his own future. I had survived the ultimate familial betrayal and emerged completely victorious. I took another slow sip of my excellent wine and smiled softly into the evening air. My foundation was finally entirely my own, and it had never been stronger. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that shared blood does not automatically grant someone the right to your endless sacrifice. We are often taught to forgive family unconditionally, but unconditional forgiveness without basic respect only breeds parasitic entitlement. True family is built on a solid foundation of mutual dignity, not the expectation of your silent suffering. When someone shows you they view your kindness as an exploitable weakness, you must believe them immediately. You must never set yourself on fire simply to keep your ungrateful children warm. The most profound act of self-preservation is having the absolute courage to walk away and let them burn in the fires of their own making. If you believe that respect must be earned and that toxic family members should face the absolute consequences of their actions, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story in the comments below.